Last night, Fox News presented the first Republican presidential debate featuring 10 of the candidates for 2 hours and the other 7 in a forum beforehand. While Donald Trump and Jeb Bush dominated the total time, the other candidates seemed to strike a few zingers on various issues. Patty, this was a big deal. We just heard before we started rolling tape that the 24 million people watched the debate, so obviously it had a lot of interest nationwide, at least maybe not for the full 2 hours, but for some of it. What were your impressions?
Well, I think people around this country, just like the group I was with, were glued to the screen. It was like waiting to watch a car wreck. And in fact, it even kind of started that way with the traffic jam of candidates coming on the stage. It was like people getting out of a clown car. And in fact, the first 10 minutes leading up to it with the Fox newscasters was kind of a clown show too. It just seemed very unorganized. But once they got talking, the format, God knows how, worked all right with 10 people. Donald Trump took the lion's share of both the attention and the time, but he certainly livened things up. I would say he was exactly what we would have expected. Jeb Bush was a lot duller, and he seemed more nervous than I would have thought. But the other candidates were fascinating. The governor of Ohio was the one who really stepped forward and made the most impression, except for Carly Fiorina, who was at the kids' table for the earlier speech. But it was a fascinating lesson. I'm not entirely sure it's in democracy, but it was great. I can only wish that there were 17 Democratic candidates running so that we could have as much political discussion as we're having right now because of that. Rosie O'Donnell, I think, would be willing to run after the Donald Trump crack last night. Surely there's some other Democrats who'd like to jump in.
David, I think Patty brings up a good point. At some point, do you think there's going to be conversation that there's 17, which is far too many presidential candidates on the Republican side of the coin, but really there's barely a handful on the Democratic side? I mean, we swim in this stuff, and I can name maybe 2 or 3, and that's tops. And even to think that's going to be competitive, who knows? But what was your overall impressions and reactions from how last night went down?
Well, the Democratic field early in the race in 72 was quite large. About a dozen, and in 76 it was even larger than that. It might have been around 15 or so. Both times somebody who was a back-of-the-pack underdog the year before won, hardly even noticed in some respects, won the nomination. McGovern in 72, Carter in 76, and of course Carter won the general election. So there's nothing wrong with a lot of qualified people in the party wanting to run. And I think the debates are a good innovation that will help voters make up their minds and select potential people before they have to start voting. As Patty said, I think that the two who improved themselves the most to continue into the further rounds with fundraising and getting volunteer support were John Kasich, the governor of Ohio, at the main debate, and Carly Fiorina, the former Hewlett-Packard executive and California Senate candidate, at the happy hour debate, as it was called. We learned some interesting things. First of all, the Fox moderators, I thought, did an outstanding job. They asked all the candidates lots of tough, on-point, well-informed questions, not a bunch of softballs. You could not possibly imagine, say, an MSNBC debate where those hosts, or CNN, were asking Democratic candidates such really tough questions. And I'm glad they did ask the tough questions, because if you want to be president, you ought to be able to answer those questions, even though Donald Trump went into another Twitter tantrum at 3:30 in the morning about that, and some other people think that Fox is just supposed to be there to blow up the candidates. As you know, what are the 3 things you hate the most about Hillary Clinton, and ask all of them. We learned interesting stuff, that Hillary Clinton, there's so many ways to bribe her and so many things she'll do. She came to Trump's wedding because he paid her. And I will say, it makes me feel all the more prouder about my wedding, where we didn't have to pay any of the guests to attend. Donald Trump was so low in substance, such a nothing but reality TV character, clearly one of the most interesting hair approach, but had very little to say beyond platitudes. And you had a lot of other candidates who did have something to say and have some real ideas beyond slogans.
Eric, I guess for me, the most impressive candidate for me was John Kasich, and I loved his point about gay marriage, and I think, frankly, that probably helped him get a little bit of traction, at least for the next 5-10 minutes. I realize the debate overall has nothing to do with next November. It has something to do with next week. If some of these folks can get a little more traction, a little more funding, change their order so that they're close to the top tier, maybe some of the top tier folks move around. Based on that, as we look at this a week ahead, 10 days from now, do you see any movement within any of the names we've mentioned?
Yeah, no, I think there'll be some movement. I think you hit it with Kasich. I think Kasich had a very good night. He also had a home field advantage. It was his crowd. What I was most interested in his response to the gay marriage question was not his response as much as the crowd reaction. And yes, he's their governor and he's their favorite. But nonetheless, that was a very warm reaction. And other people who took a different attitude on that issue did not get that reaction. So perhaps the times they are changing,
and
as
it's
they
Ohio,
say.
the battleground
And
state.
it's also Ohio. Now that said, I find myself with this whole Republican primary, and yes, I'm a political analyst and or at least reputed to be one, but I sometimes question my own judgment about how to evaluate them. If I'm thinking that John Kasich is really hitting it and nailing it, and Donald Trump is falling on his face, but then the polls say people love Donald Trump. And to the extent that Trump is the flavor of the day, the week, the month, or a longer period of time, I question my own judgment because I just don't get it. I don't see it in any way, shape, or form. I agree with David as to the Fox News troika, the three moderators. I thought they did a really well above average job of handling this. They were inquisitors. Some of the moments between Megyn Kelly and Donald Trump, I mean, I think those were great TV moments, and more credit to her. When you have Frank Bruni, a left of center liberal commentator in the New York Times, writing a column this morning with a shout out to the three Fox hosts, that tells you something. The most important moment of the evening in terms of lasting impact was in the first 15 seconds. And that's when the question was, who will pledge to support, who here will not pledge to support the nominee of the party? And Trump raised his hand, and it was the start of what I think was a bad evening for him. But again, who am I to judge here? Just some real quick one-word descriptions or one or two-word descriptions. Bush, safe, defensive. Trump, I could go on and on. Embarrassment, buffoon, bombastic, you name it. Rubio, I think, had a good evening as well. I put him down as polished. Huckabee, preacher. Paul, isolationist. Walker, polished, but a little bit overly programmed. Kasich, maybe breakout. Finally, the last breakout candidate was Carly Fiorina, who no one saw because she was on the early show. But everyone read the news clips and then saw some of the some of the video clips, and she'll be on the main stage from here on out.
Natasha, I'm not sure if I agree totally on the how well the moderators did. It seemed a little back and forth. I at least have one problem with the producers picking the last moment of the debate, last question of the debate being about, not about faith or how faith might be part of your decision, but has God talked to you? It was almost like as a parting shot to Jon Stewart saying, don't you want to stick around another week just to talk about this one question? But all that being aside, what did you think about the debate? What stood out for you?
Well, who knows? It might force Jon Stewart out of retirement just to come back and do a special on that question.
If anything would, it'd be that, yes.
Yeah, it raises an interesting question about the media's treatment of Donald Trump right now, and I'm guilty of it too. Like, it's so easy to just sort of be gleeful about what he brings to the race, but we also have to be careful about how we have these conversations right now, not only with Trump, but with the questions that we choose to give to any of these candidates. You know, to borrow from the Sound of Music, I think Republicans right now are saying, like, how do we solve a problem like Donald Trump? And each of the candidates had a very different take yesterday. Some were combative, some were not. You have somebody like Mark Rubio, who basically was like, I'm in a room by myself, I'm going to give really nice quotes and make a plea for why I should be a vice presidential candidate, and I think he did that well. But no one had a good way of how do we get around this big elephant in the room. And I don't think that's going to stop with the Republicans. I think it's going to be a big part of Hillary Clinton's campaign as well. So as we're looking at that, how do we deal with a problem like Donald Trump? Not that he's a problem, but our coverage of him sometimes is. And we need to be looking at the presidential election as the important position race that it is and treat it that way.
I've heard a lot of comments about Donald Trump, but you have just made sure that I will never watch Sound of Music the same ever again. Well done, Natasha. Well done.